of what we're going over today. It looks like a lot, but I promise it's not. We're not gonna kill you with boredom and stuff. We're here to understand, okay? We just want to freaking understand what the hell is going on, okay? So, the origins of Zionism. There's this guy named Theodor Herzl. He was actually an Austro-Hungarian from Budapest, and he had actually never identified as a Jewish person. He is like Jewish, but he never identified with his Jewishness up until he got hired to be a commentator at a trial. It was called the Dreyfus Trials, and it was this guy named Alfred Dreyfus. He got accused of selling secrets to the German army, and they were all wrong. Accusations were all wrong, and the trial took Europe by sensation. It was a tremendous trial at the time, and all the accusations were based on racism and anti-Semitism. And when this trial happened, anti-Semitism really took a rise, and it took a great hit in Europe, and people started identifying with like anti-Jewishness. Especially, so Theodor Herzl, it hit him especially hard. He started seeing the prosecutions and the persecutions of Jewish people and how badly they were being like oppressed in Europe as Jews. In 1896, he wrote a book called the Der Judenstaat, which literally translates to the Jewish state. In it, he delineates a utopic, like, piece of land, a Jewish state for Jewish people in which they are the majority and hold the majority. And he called this theory Zionism. It outlined a Jewish state in which Jews would live by themselves and be the equals of any men. This book got translated into tens of languages, and it was tremendous. Like, people started eating it up, like Jews, non-Jews, and the West especially, so Europe and the US, they started to very much identify with this, and they started to link up with the Zionists in Europe. 1896, the book is written, and Zionism really is born. And then we have the Aliyahs, which are the immigrations of Jews from their diaspora all over the world, not just in Europe. So they were everywhere. Jews were everywhere, and they still are. Into different Aliyahs, so that like different like mass immigrations into Palestine. Each Aliyah was a different catastrophe, but the biggest one in which the greatest amount of Jews were moved and the greatest amount of Palestinians were persecuted and exiled was Nakba, May 15th, 1948, which should be still recognized today as the catastrophe in the Arab world, not just in Palestine. Like, Arabs across the region recognize this as like a tremendous event. That event resulted in 750,000 Palestinians exiled out of their land, and we have accounts of tremendous stories come out of that against women especially. But that's a brief overview of how the theory got started. Jews were surprised that there were even people in Palestine. They were like, there's Arabs here? Like, I thought it was empty. And it wasn't until it was a certain year, 1905, that the Zionists came to the conclusion together. It was not coming to be realized that Palestine was not empty. That's like a quote out of a book. And so the question that comes out of this is, when and how was Zionism able to ignore the presence of an entire people in the territory of Palestine? Like, up until when were they going to ignore this? And the answer, honestly, the only conclusion that we can come up with is that Zionism did not want to be aware of the Arabs. They were always seen as an obstacle to the Jewish state. Asher Ginsburg, a renowned writer who opposed the Jewish state, he was a Jew who was anti-Zionist, he said, "From the very beginning, we have always ignored the Arab people. The Zionist movement from the very beginning aimed at superseding the Arabs on their own soil." The research I was doing was obviously looking at Zionism as a colonial movement. How is Zionism used to literally colonize an entire people? And you see that even up until today. Like, before I get into the history of it, Israelis are literally taking our food, our culture, our clothing, our everything up until our language, because until they take our language, that's like recognizing that like we are Arab and that there's a people here that is indigenous to the land. So our keffiyeh, like the scarf, they call that theirs. Our hummus, damiyah, like all our food is like, they call it Israeli food. Yeah, like it's a literal theft and colonization of an indigenous people. So like the early Jews, the early Jewish immigrants, when they were first immigrating, so that like back when like the first Aliyahs were happening, they were facing a dilemma. And the dilemma was, should we make this state an ethnic plantation or a pure settlement? So like, and you have to pay attention, like these two ideologies are stemming from European colonialism. They are taking these ideas from how Europeans used to go and colonize into Africa, South Asia, Latin America, everywhere. So these are two of the main ways that they used to colonize black and brown countries, like up until this day. Ethnic plantation is using indentured servitude or forced labor of the indigenous population to work the land. And that's one of the ideas that they were going to use in Palestine. The other one was pure settlement, and that was to bring in as much Jewish people as possible so that they became the majority. Up until the third Aliyah, so like early 1900s, there were 450,000 Palestinians in Palestine. They were the majority, they were the indigenous, and they still are the indigenous population. So Jews were like, okay, how the hell are we going to colonize this? We have two options, pure settlement. Pure settlement won out, and they were like, we need to immigrate as many people like as fast as possible, and that enforced the Aliyahs to keep happening. The first Aliyah was the first attempt at a pure settlement colony in Palestine, in which around 500,000 Palestinians were already there. Okay, great. When they got there, they were like, we need to work. Okay, so how are we going to get jobs? So they sold a bunch of land, and which was easy because the English were helping them very easily. They sold a bunch of Palestinian land to Jewish landowners. The Jewish landowners, however, still continued to hire Palestinians because they were the cheap labor force. Of course they were. They were the colonized, they were the cheap labor force. So Jews couldn't find work. Also, they didn't like the work of the Arabs. Jewish immigrants during this time were not able to gain a stronghold in Palestine. Their support for land acquisition and formation was inconsistent, and many immigrants were not happy with working the low unskilled jobs of Palestine. So like these low unskilled jobs were like farming, pastoral, taking care of animals. Like they were not having that. So the Aliyah didn't fail, but a lot of Jews just weren't able to stay. They couldn't find work, they didn't like the work. The second Aliyah then caused a revolution against the first one, and that was looking into the labor market. The Jews literally unionized. Like they made a union against their landowners, like the Jewish landowners of Palestinian land. And they said, you need to hire all of us, and we need to take this land because we need to come here and we need to be the majority. Again, going into the pure settlement, we need to be the majority. And so in 1905, they did a conquest of labor, and they struggled to work. The second Aliyah's own method of settlement was the pure settlement colony method, and its aim was to control the land, employment, and to ensure a European standard of living. I remember a direct quote out of the book I was researching out of, that even the poorest Eastern European Jews wouldn't take the work that the Palestinians were doing. Like they hated it. Like it was that bad. And so they wanted to control the land themselves in order to not do that work that they were doing and still just like be basically rich landowners. And therefore it spurred on capitalist industrialism of land, because that had never existed in Palestine up until then, and people still to this day like resist it. Like land was always accessible to the masses. It was a communal like thing, and then when the Zionists came in and like took it and started dividing it amongst themselves, it was like, oh, land is like property now and it can be sold and it has price on it. So you can see the inquest of Zionism and also the destructive, like the catastrophe of capitalism coming in as well. Elon's going to talk about the Jewish state.
Okay, so like for thousands of years, Jews were an international people. Like they didn't have a state. They still are an international people. So the idea of a Jewish state of Zionism needs a Jewish majority. There was no place in the world where Jews had a natural majority. So in order to create a majority, it had to be artificially done, which is how they got to Palestine. Most Jews prior to the 30s were not super supportive of the idea of Zionism. Most wanted freedom and emancipation in their own homelands, particularly Eastern and Western Europe. So, but then after World War II, the philosophy of Jewish independence kind of changed to the point where people felt like they needed a formal state. And of course, those fears were exploited by imperialists in order to get them to go there. So
You still see this fear exploited, basically exactly like you said, in these Zionist institutions in which we're raised, like Sunday school, for example, where you have Judaic studies and you have Hebrew class. And in Judaic studies, you don't learn about international Judaism, you don't learn about Mizrahi Judaism, Maghrebi Judaism, you don't learn about, Jews in China, Jews in India, Jews in Buenos Aires. You learn about the Holocaust as the problem and Israel as the solution.
Yeah.
And that's the entirety of your Jewish education when you're growing up.
And there's a lot of, even today, I think we experience it in like the comment sections a lot, is like the idea of like, well, if Israel didn't exist, we'd all be dead. Which is a very common like Zionist thought, that Israel is the reason Jews still exist, and any attempt to discredit the state of Israel is an attempt of another genocide of the Jewish people.